Welcome to the Doggy Dojo. I'm your host, Susan Light, a Los Angeles-based dog trainer and behavior consultant on a quest to become worthy of the title Sensei of the Doggy Dojo. Today we're talking about something a lot of dog parents want some help with: barking. My guest has been on the show before. She talked us through options for equipment, pros and cons to different types of collars, harnesses, and leashes. She's an applied animal behaviorist and the founder of R Plus Dogs, and she's recently launched a members-only community called R Plus Dog Guardians. Please welcome back Renee Rhoades. Welcome to the podcast, Renee. Welcome back, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about what I think is a huge, huge topic for most people that have dogs: barking.
Absolutely. Huge. I think number one, why is my dog barking?
Yeah. And probably the number one nuisance behavior that people seek out help from. It's kind of funny because I think a lot of people equate a well-behaved dog with just a dog that doesn't bark a lot.
Yeah, I have a saying, which is, there's a lot of parallels between children, but, the old adage of kids should be seen and not heard. And I often use that when I'm talking about dogs and barking.
Yeah. Why is it that barking bothers us so much? Why is this the number one thing that we want to stop dogs from doing?
Well, it's interesting because I looked into this a little deeper. I know that barking has some social, kind of stressful connotations with it, especially in situations like apartment buildings or close quarter. I live in the UK and the houses are basically on top of each other in a lot of areas. So I think we're always cognizant of our neighbors, and if you live in apartment complex, you might get kicked out or, be that person with that dog. So there's that kind of aspect. And then it also has to do with our nervous system. So barking is, especially when it kind of happens and we're not prepared for it, it taps into that kind of primal feeling of something is uncomfortable, something's going on. And so that also can sometimes, especially if you're not expecting and your dog barks, you can feel that rise in stress almost immediately. And I mean, even my husband, sometimes we can see that Lycan's about to bark and he's still oh, it still scared me, But it's just because, that kind of primal, and it almost says to you something is up. And you kind of, again, equating it back to human behavior. If someone's yelling or acting just a bit odd and making noise, that's going to draw a lot of attention. And that attention can feel sometimes embarrassing if you're outside with your dog and they start barking. Everyone's kind of looking at you either what's going on there or, what's wrong with that dog. Again, dogs should be seen and not heard. And it's also seen as somewhat of quote unquote aggressive behavior if a dog is barking. And oftentimes a lot of people are confused about barking during play. And so they're oh, my dog is growling or my dog is, barking. Is this something that I should be concerned about? And oftentimes it's not. But there's several things that are kind of floating around when it comes to the barking aspect.
I love that you pointed out. I mean, obviously we're worried about people judging us. So true about the neighbors, having that complaint. But babies cry. If your neighbor has a crying baby.
Well, I mean, even that, I think people, would I say that I've gotten annoyed by a child screaming or crying, especially on an airplane, close quarters where you can't really escape? Absolutely. I mean, I would say that that's probably happened more times than I can count. But I think that is also something that we should consider. Look, I like to look a little deeper in myself. I will also ask myself things why am I bothered by this? And so that also leads me down the path of, because that was the thing with barking. I was why am I so bothered by barking? um, how can if I can understand it better, then maybe I can pull that in, and once I understand it better, be better about it, if that makes sense. And that definitely helped by researching more about like what is it internally that's going on, and why are we so put off and uncomfortable with barking.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really great to recognize that, like a crying baby, um, the barking activates this part of your nervous system, like you said. I
Mm.
think that I read somewhere that crying babies, like, were primed to respond to that, like, for it to activate us. And that's like a survival thing, right? So that we don't just leave the babies crying, that we get up and do something about it and take care of them. I don't study babies, so maybe don't quote me on that. But I think,
I have heard that as well. Yeah, that there
yeah,
is a certain tone, such a pitch. Yeah, that
yeah,
is.
you can't sit there and just be like, oh, it's fine. Like, your brain can't do it. So I think it's good to recognize, sometimes your nervous system gets involved without you meaning it to. It's just a
Yeah,
normal
absolutely.
response to that sound.
The autonomic nervous system is doing all kinds of things that we just can't, and with our dogs too, that we just can't help. And like I will often say, reactivity is not a choice. The dog is not
Yes.
choosing to be like this. They're not, oftentimes the saying is barking is communication, and it's said a million times, but it's so true that if your dog is uncomfortable with something, they're going to communicate that in one way or another.
Yeah. So let's get into it. Why are the dogs barking? What is the function of barking?
Well,
Prepare.
communication. Yeah. But kind of broadening that, it's there's different types, obviously, of communication, especially like vocal communication. So dogs will talk to other dogs, dogs will talk to us, they'll talk to other animals. I mean, it is an extension for me of body language. So when we think of language for dogs, we often think of body language. If we're talking about it, we know just a little bit, but the vocalizations for me kind of tie into that, because the body language is then gonna a little bit kind of mirror and give you a fuller picture. But we have like alert, like I mentioned about play, dogs that are fearful, anxious, um, dogs will bark for, and I'm specifically thinking of a situation with Nero, but they will bark to get your attention. They will
Hmm.
bark to communicate with you a need or a desire.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're having trouble figuring out why your dog is barking, great time to reach out to a trainer who can help you break it down. Because I think it's really important that you address it in the right way. There's really no one size fits all response to barking, because it could be so many different things.
Yeah, there's tons of contextual information, and it may not even be things that we are able to even identify. It sometimes takes a bit of digging, a bit of trial and error, to kind of tweak those things to see why. I mean, I often will say to clients, if they, look at the context of the situation, where is that communication happening, and then what is your response? So, that will then kind of dictate. So a lot of people, the term, I suppose, that gets thrown around often is like attention seeking, which
Hmm.
is not my favorite term, because like I said, for me, I'm like, well, what are you trying to communicate? But if you think that your dog is just getting attention, it kind of denotes that the dog is almost like a little bit like bothersome, and it's like, well, you got what you need. But it's just a further communication to say, like, maybe this isn't it, or there's something else that I kind of need from you. um, and that's a little harder to sometimes unpick. It really, I think you're right that it does take a professional sometimes, because you don't know what you don't know. And if your dog is trying to communicate with you and you've tried XYZ, and it's not getting there, that can be extremely frustrating. And we might deviate to trying things that aren't very ethically sound, just
Mm.
for the sake of trying to stop our dogs barking.
Yeah, let's talk about that while we're here. There are a lot of products and procedures, we could say, that are meant to stop your dog from barking. So we have bark collars and, like, just I'm not. It's fun. This wasn't one of our questions, so I'm not like super prepared with my
Oh, I
list
can
of
I can
things.
help
Right?
you.
Yeah, help me
Bark,
out because
yeah,
yeah.
ultrasonic
Oh
devices.
God, yeah,
Yes. Spray bottles. People will spray their dog
yeah.
with water to stop them from barking. Yeah, citronella collars. So like the
Mm,
spray collar, but there are quite a few. I mean, the vibration ones for sure, those seem to be really, really popular. And I think it's not, I mean, nothing is really the guardian's fault because obviously, like, if you're on social media as a dog professional, you A, lose your mind,
yeah,
and B, you're like, wow, if I didn't
yeah.
know what I didn't know. It's often these things are being marketed as humane. They're quick, resolution to a problem. And if you don't know that, I mean, I think on some level people understand that barking is communication, but it's like, you're not, what are you barking at? There's nothing there. Or
Mm,
that's, Tim, and we like Tim, and you're embarrassing me. And then, so there's again kind of those social and like individual pressures that are going on. But
yeah,
yeah, a lot of those types of tools, let's say, or products that are marketed as one thing really are quite the opposite. And I do believe that if dog guardians had that knowledge, that this thing that is being marketed as this quick humane doesn't do anything to the dog, and what it actually is doing in that situation, I think that I couldn't imagine that they would be like, sure, I'll still take it.
yeah. Well, we probably don't have time to go into all of them, but because this is such a nuisance behavior and people feel like they need a quick result, I do feel like people would be tempted to reach for one of these. So let's just walk through what is actually happening. Let's use the citronella bark collar as the example. Tell everybody why that's not the solution, like what's actually happening, what the dog experience is, and why it's not going to really solve your problem.
So with the citronella collar specifically, it has these little canisters that spray citronella towards the dog, and they are usually off of like a vibration. So it's a collar that sits a strategic way on the dog. And if there is barking and it is the sensor, alerts to barking, then it'll spray this into the dog. And the goal is for the citronella spray to be aversive. So it is for it to be as uncomfortable for the dog as possible. Oftentimes with citronella, it is the smell. I mean, if you've ever smelled citronella, summertime, mosquitoes, things like that. But imagine that being concentrated almost directly up your nose. As a
Mm,
dog who
mm,
has a significant portion of their brain dedicated to scent,
mm-hmm.
that's sprayed right in your face. I mean, I kind of think sometimes my brain works weird, but I kind of think sometimes about these things as like, those movies where people go into the mall and they're like being sprayed with all these
Mm,
perfumes and things. Like it's like that where you're like, get, like I don't want to smell like these things. The dog has no choice. And so
yeah.
that happens. And yeah, sometimes the dog will stop barking because it doesn't smell, it isn't a good experience. Some dogs will become collar wise. So they know when that collar isn't on and they know when they can bark. And that is just proving the point that that emotional element, the underpinning reason why the dog is most likely barking, is not being addressed.
Mm,
So the citronella will repress that behavior, but we're not talking about what is actually causing that behavior to happen. Maybe the dog is fearful. Maybe there's a certain sound that happens, then the dog is alerting. There's like I said, lots of different motivations for things, but the citronella collar is meant to be as uncomfortable as possible.
Yeah. And I got news for you guys. If the emotional motivation for that barking is stronger than the unpleasant effect of being squirted in the face, dog's still going to bark.
Yeah. I remember once I was at a store and a lady was having a conversation, and the other lady had advice. She was talking about, oh, my dog barks all the time, because I guess they had the same breed, I think. But she was saying, yeah, you just need to get one of those collars for the dog, one of those collars that like spray them in the face. And she was like, oh yeah, I tried that. She just kept barking. And then they were laughing, and I was like, oh gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
That poor dog.
yeah, I was just like, oh,
Yeah.
this wasn't even like an animal store or anything. I was like, I'm just minding my own business.
If you'd like to learn more about Renee's members-only community, check out rplusguardians.com. That's just the letter R and plus is spelled out, but don't worry, I'll put the link in the show notes to make it easy. You can also find her on Facebook as R plus Dogs Behavior and Instagram under R plus Dogs. We'll be right back. We can't go into like a treatment plan, and I wouldn't want you to for each of these types of barking, but we just want people to realize like barking is a symptom behavior. It's being caused by something, or it's communication, like you said. Are there some broad categories of those communications? Like I think you said fearful. Yeah.
Yeah. So like seeking, so like a need or a want, that would be one for sure. Playing, so that kind of levels into that type of communication. And then what we talked about, fearful and anxious, I would say. So that for me is for me, barking, I've really changed my perspective on barking. I very much used to be, when I initially heard barking, was kind of like, oh, let's settle this back down, like almost like, oh, no barking, no barking, that's bad.
Right.
Whereas now I'm like, what is that barking telling me? For instance, in my house, we have several yards that are connected, and there's a group of dogs that are kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Not parallel. What's the word I'm looking for? Across, basically. I can't think of the technical term, but there's multiple dogs. I think someone said like five or six dogs or something. And every day around the same time, around 9:30 in the morning, those dogs, the guardian gets them in a van and takes them somewhere, and they go nuts. They're barking and everything. If Nero is outside at that time, he will start to bark at them. I'm not quite sure what he is communicating there, but it is definitely towards those dogs. He does act a little bit like a regulator. So I imagine if he's like, hey, keep it down over there, but who knows? But the barking is it's very different than any other barking that he does. And so that in the morning, a long time ago, I used to be like, come on, sweetie, come inside. I use my recall cue for inside, and he'd come in, and, I thought like, oh, this is a problem that I really need to address. And now I see that once he's given the opportunity to communicate whatever it is, again, that he's communicating to these dogs, he's done. And so it doesn't go on and on and on and on. But that level is something that I'm kind of monitoring. So when we're talking about like fearful, anxious dogs, it's not to say like just let your dog bark, because if they're distressed, and I think everyone kind of knows that level, if you will, with your dog. I mean, there was a study that indicated that people understood the different types of barks that their dogs might do. And I definitely, can attest to that. But with that, I just kind of let it ride out, and then he's done. And it's like, he's got his little bark. If I don't want that, then I, either he's not outside at that time, or I ask him to come in. But oftentimes he's like, I've had the little bark, and that's it. He doesn't race out at that time. He doesn't. It's just like if he's out there and it happens, he has to have a say about it. And then he's like, nah, I'm done. But changing that perspective, and it's also softened the way that I feel about barking. Obviously, within certain times of the day, I don't, for my neighbor's sake and things like that. But I often let barking happen unless I can tell that it's that, okay, I'm really starting to get upset here. And then I want to step in and kind of, soften that for the dogs.
Yeah. That sounds a little bit similar to like Kiki Yablon's "Thank you for barking" for like alert barking, where it's like, yeah, good job, I gotcha. That's done, you know.
Yeah, I used to use a lot of food. I don't use so much food anymore. I would say in the last maybe year ish, um, I've really started deviating towards like looking at the individual, because Lycan will take food, he will take play, he will take toys, he will take comfort. And so if he is barking, I just positively interrupt him and I say, like, come here. And then I just like physically soothe him. And within a couple minutes, he's like, oh, thank you. Like, there was something scary out there. And Nero's the same. If I just, like I say, when I say inside, I just verbally will be like, oh my gosh, you are such a good boy. Look at you, you little barksy boy. And he's like, that was great. But
Mm.
I mean, food, yes, but I also think like understanding like what your dog needs in that moment and offering that, almost like, that I see that you're uncomfortable, let me socially and, support you. Or I see that you're really excited about barking at those dogs. Like, you did a good job. Well done. Instead of just kind of deviating to the food.
Yeah, like completing the communication loop of
Yeah.
like, I hear you, let's, address how you're feeling. Love it. I love that. So last question for you, because I feel like we could talk about this forever.
Yeah.
But it's really not the purpose of the podcast to try to take individual cases, right? Just sort of give you guys some broad knowledge about like how to approach this stuff. But what if you do have a barking emergency? Like your neighbors are complaining, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. Is there something someone can do that's not turning to the ultrasonics? Which, by the way, the ultrasonic, I have had clients whose neighbors got those and it absolutely drove their dogs crazy.
Oh,
Like
wow.
the
Interesting.
ultrasonic is, I'm so against it. I mean, I'm against most of these interventions, but that one to me, it seems pretty cruddy to do it to other people's dogs. Do you know
Yeah.
what I
Like,
mean?
if you can't hear
Like it's
something,
your
it's kind of
apartment.
like, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And if you can't, like, how do you know what that's, I just, yeah, like, how do you
yeah,
know what it's doing?
to them, absolutely. But is there something that they can do in that kind of situation that's not turning to one of these quick fixes that are not very humane?
Well, my automatic response is going to be like, seek a dog professional. But if
Yeah.
that's not a viable resource, it's going to be to explore what is the context of the barking. So like, when is it happening? And keeping a record is really important, because if you are keeping a record of what is happening, then that gives you the data to be able to be like, okay, it's at this time, usually it's right before this happens, or, so all of those kind of parameters in that data is going to get you closer to understanding why your dog's barking. If your dog is barking and there is no like discernible pattern, the first thing I'm gonna say, if somebody contacted me, I'm like, my dog is barking all the time, and it's driving me crazy. And it's like, okay, when was the last time that they were checked out by a vet, got any blood work? Have you had any kind of physical exam? And that's just right off the bat is just like, okay, let's kind of unturn that stone and see if there's anything there. Um, because for me, that's going to be the first thing that we look at is there any medical concern?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Past that is, again, if you are like, well, it's something that I can't actually figure out, it's going to be best to work with somebody, because they're going to help you to unpick that. I mean, the amount of times that clients have said to me, like, I didn't think about that, or, oh yeah. And then it's like, we can build these untangible things, can then start, we can build threads. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. But yeah, I would say vet check, make sure that there's nothing medical, blood work, physical exams when you go in for an actual hands on the dog, that may not elicit any sort of response. So you might have to go a little deeper. And that's why I think the recording of the data, what your dog is doing, literally just like study your dog for a week, 2 weeks, and figure out, like, you may be able to unpick things really, really quickly. And then that will give you the information, that symptom, and then what is the root of that.
Yeah, I love that. I think I see when we were talking about social media, so many people that are like, I got a dog, and then when I leave it for work, it's just barking all day.
Yeah, dogs are social animals. I mean, the thing is, right, like, oh, they need another dog. And I'm like, no, don't do that, because then you might have two dogs that are, feeling separation distress. It's often, at least in my practice, I find that there's fundamental needs. So, mental, physical, species specific, social, there's all of these kind of fundamental needs that dogs have that we can easily meet, if we know what they are.
Yeah, I love that. And that falls under enrichment, which I talk about on the podcast all the time.
Yeah. Enrichment, I really break down for clients, like I said, like that kind of physical, mental, and then species specific, because I think enrichment, at least when, I first started consulting, no one knew what enrichment was. And now there is it's such a huge turn over the last, 5 years or so. But I still think we're often kind of like, it's better, don't get me wrong, but we're just missing the mark. We tend to think of enrichment as like things we kind of give our dog, but it's like the ultimate thing that you can give is like choice, right? Or it's not necessarily a toy, but it might be just that 20 minutes cuddling, and the dog's like, oh, this was nice. I really, like for the dogs that have separation distress, it's like, how much are you left alone? How much time is being dedicated towards that social aspect? And it's kind of like unticking, all of this list of like, are we meeting your fundamental needs, like as a being? And then what are we left with?
Yeah, I love that. So sorry to anyone that was listening to this hoping for a quick fix to your dog barking. But I think it's such a big issue, and so many things that could be going on, that I hope people can sort of start to look at it more like we do, like the professionals do.
Yeah, the analogy of the crying baby is very apt, and it's often something that I will use as a reference point to clients to kind of start them out. Is, with the baby, it's kind of like, have I fed you? Have I changed you? Have I burped you? Have I played with you? Have I bathed you? And so you run on this list with your dog in the same kind of way of like, have I met this? Have I done this? Have we been this? And so then you kind of that mental list. But it's funny. I was talking to a client earlier, and my mom was in the room, and I was leaving them a voicemail, and she was like, are you talking about a dog or a child? And I was like, same's really. I mean, like, I
there's
said,
a lot of overlap.
About a child, and she was like, I know you're talking about a dog, but it sounds like you're talking about someone's child. And I was like, well, for some people that is, but I said, it's, what family's like when you're a professional dog.
Oh yeah.
They're like, I know more than you. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But yeah, there are a lot of similarities in that case. Not the same, but a lot of similarities.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have children, but I find my clients that are parents, especially of young children, when you're explaining it, they really get on the wavelength quickly, because they're like, oh God, it's so similar to raising young kids that can't communicate with you and tell you exactly what it is that they need.
Yeah. I mean, I have a 5-year-old nephew, and I have, because of COVID, I haven't really been able to visit because everything was kind of locked down. And so when I saw him as a baby and then I saw him as a 4-year-old, and I was like, wow, I don't have any like issues with him, and we communicate well, and I'm listening, I'm a safe space for him almost immediately. And it's like all of my work with dogs has prepared me. And, so it's been interesting to see that, because I don't have any children yet either, but it's been interesting to see how those apply, that crossover. But it's very
behavior is pretty universal.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So it's fascinating. And I learned more about myself.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, I joke that I learned about dogs first, and then I learned about being a human.
They're amazing teachers. Amazing teachers, if we're listening. Renee, thank you so much for coming by again. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for stopping by the dojo this week. This is your aspiring sensei, Susan Light, signing off. You can find me at doggydojopodcast.com, or I'm Susan Light LA on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook. The music was written by MacLight. You can find him at maclightsongwriter.com. If you like the show, you can support it by subscribing, sharing it with your friends, rating it, and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts. Just a reminder, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and does not constitute advice or professional services by either the host or any of the guests. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another new episode of the Doggy Dojo.